you to the study session for the Mesa City Council for June the 18th. Mr. Glover and Freeman are not with us, but I believe we have Mr. Freeman on the telephone. Is that right, Mr. Freeman? Or maybe it's Mr. Glover. Do we have either Mr. Freeman or Mr. Glover on the telephone? Okay, I believe they're scheduled to join us, so we'll ask maybe a little bit later. But we were expecting...
Mayor, I'm on the phone. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you, Mark. Good to have you with us. The first item on our agenda for this meeting is to review the items on the regular and special council meeting agendas for tonight. Just to remind everyone, we're going to begin tonight at 5:50 with a special council meeting for the sole purpose of putting the home rule issue on the ballot. So that's what we will begin upstairs with at 5:50. And then following that, we will have the regular council meeting. Council, any questions regarding the special council meeting? Okay, if not, then I'd please take a look at the agenda for the regular council meeting. We currently have a few items off the consent agenda, but let's see if we need to take anything else off. Anything under liquor license applications or purchase contracts, agenda items 3 and 4. Agenda item 5 are various resolutions. They're all currently on the consent agenda, but I thought it was interesting. Agenda item 5G has to do with us lowering our city's property tax, which is a good thing. So, Mr. Brady, what do we need to know about this?
It's good. That means the city is growing. Our property values are increasing, as well as we're experiencing new value to our tax base. So this is a good sign. We've not had the opportunity to do this often, but this is an opportunity to reduce the tax rate. Now, if your values have gone up faster than the 7%, you may pay a little bit more. But I believe for many, there will be a slight actual decrease in the tax levy. But for everyone, the tax rate will be decreased by 7%.
Okay. So again, this is a result of the economy growing, more folks being on the tax rolls, more large commercial buildings being on the tax rolls. As a result of that, we can lower the tax rate citywide. Okay. Well, that's good news. So that's agenda item 5G. That'll stay on the consent agenda, but it is worth noting that that's what we're doing. Agenda item 6. Setting the hearing dates for various ordinances. 7 is action on a subdivision plat. And then we do have a few items off the consent agenda. Agenda item 8A is a public hearing for annexation. It's not an action item, but we will be having a public hearing to take public comment on a proposed annexation. And then agenda item 9, or 9A through E, are all related to the same zoning case. A and B have to do with an annexation, and then C is the public hearing, and then D and E is taking action. So again, this is a zoning case that there's been a tremendous amount of activity on, and just congratulations to everyone involved in negotiating a resolution on this one.
Mayor?
Yes.
Mayor and
Mr.
Council,
Smith, yeah.
And Councilmember Freeman I know is on the phone, and he's provided in writing the fact that he's conflicting off of 8A because he has a relative that has an ownership interest. And so I'm not sure if he's going to still be phoning in at that time at that hearing, but I was just going to let you know that. And so he's provided that in writing for the city.
So is he's conflicted off of all agenda items related to number 9?
No,
8A.
Oh, I'm sorry, 8, excuse me. Oh, you're right. Right, okay, thank you very much.
Is that correct, Councilmember Freeman?
Yes, sir. That'd be great.
Okay. Mr. Freeman, this is a piece of property owned by a relative of yours, so you're declaring a conflict, is that right?
Yes, Mayor.
Okay, thank you. All right, so currently we just have agenda items 8 and 9 off of the consent agenda. Does that sound good to everyone? Okay, then proceeding with the rest of this meeting. The next item on our agenda is to hear a presentation and discuss the 2018 state legislative update. Good to have our intergov team here. Worked hard all session long.
Mayor, I know you're so excited to hear what the state legislature did and did not do the last few months.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. I'm Miranda DeWitt, Government Relations Manager, Scott Butler, Deputy City Manager. We are here to give you a brief overview of the 2018 legislative session. The session lasted a little bit longer than years previously, partly due to the Red for Ed movement that impacted and slowed down the budget process slightly. The governor did sign 346 bills into law. I think the most important, most important thing of this particular slide is to note that the general effective date is August 3rd, which is quickly approaching. The state budget, the good news out of the $10.4 billion state budget that was enacted is that there was no impact to state shared revenues. Obviously, our highest priorities as cities and towns is to protect these revenues and make sure that we receive the appropriate and allocated amount for cities and towns. Additional good news in regard to the highway user revenue funds. Oh, thank you. In regard to the highway user revenue funds, there was a bill passed by the legislature, signed by the governor, House Bill 2166, which created a highway safety fee that is estimated to generate $91 million to fund DPS. This is significant in regard to the HERF funds because this will reduce the amount of HERF sweeps that for years previously have been going to help fund DPS. We are now down, as you can see on the slide, down to $15 million in HERF sweeps to help fund DPS. Additionally, there was a one-time appropriation of just over $14 million to cities and towns. Again, overall, just a slight increase in HERF funds for us. In regards to the Department of Revenue funding, the last handful of years, cities and towns have been paying our proportionate share of about $20 million to help fund those state services that provide the sales tax collection on our behalf. This was nothing new this year, slight increase, but there was included in the budget, this is good news for us, about an additional 30 state employees to help provide these services for us.
So Mayor and Council, the first bill we wanted to highlight is actually a bill that did not pass, but a bill that we certainly haven't heard the end of, and that was an attempt to reform the way that the state taxes digital goods. And what is a digital good? How is it taxed? What, as our economy is shifting from something, walking into a store, we always heard the example this year of TurboTax. In the past, you'd walk into Best Buy and I was about to make a joke of whether they still exist. You'd walk into Best Buy, pick up your TurboTax, you'd pay the sales tax on the TurboTax and go home and do your taxes. Now, it's all in the cloud. I guess you can choose to download onto your computer, but you go on, you fill out your TurboTax online, you submit your taxes via that. What's a taxable transaction? And there's a lot of ambiguity in state law about that. But as the state's moving, as the country is moving more and more to cloud-based and digital-based goods, the idea of what's taxed and what's not has been an issue that the Department of Revenue has struggled with. There were certainly industry efforts this year to define what's taxable in a way that was beneficial to industry, but came at a huge cost to cities and towns. And fortunately, we had friends at the legislature who were looking and pressing the state, the numbers, the folks at the state legislature that churn out numbers talking about the fiscal impact to cities and towns to develop what they could come up with as the best estimate for the impact on cities and towns. The bill in the form it was introduced had a $120 million impact on cities and towns, and to Mesa, only to Mesa, it was roughly a $4 million impact if the bill had been enacted. So fortunately, with all the questions surrounding this, the uncertainty on the state budget at a time where they were struggling to find education funding and other things to to do a major tax break at that time was something that ultimately weighed the bill down and it wasn't able to move forward. But this effort is something that will come back next year. League of Cities and Towns, all of us would love some certainty in the tax code about digital taxation. That's needed. We support that. We think it's good public policy to come up with that. But unfortunately, doing it in a way that benefits certain industries and not others was something that had grave concerns to us. And so we look forward to participating in the stakeholder process over the summer. You'll probably hear from that. You may hear from different industries that are impacted and how they're impacted. And data centers has been a huge issue of consideration about how they're taxed and what is taxed. And with everything that we have going on throughout the city and in the Elliott Road corridor, that could have an impact on what we're seeing as far as tax revenue off of those facilities. So that'll be a big issue that comes back next year. So we just want to highlight that as you'll hear a lot about it in the coming months. The second issue, and it's like some of these bills, deja vu all over again, has been the discussion about GPLET, the government property lease excise tax. Always, after all these years of working on it, still struggle with it. But GPLET has been under attack at the legislature now for nearly a decade as folks have tried to take away this tool that cities and towns use, one of the few tools we have since we don't have TIF financing and some of the other economic development tools that are available in other states. And so GPLET's one of the few opportunities that we have to work with developers and find ways to do redevelopment on property that has been blighted or has other restraints from development. So we have worked with the Arizona Tax Research Association, other public policy groups, I'm struggling to find how to describe them, interests that would like to see this tool restrained. And so we believe that we worked a good compromise this year. It did not have a negative impact on Mesa's current central business district that the City Council had adopted and had expanded in years past to include areas that were allowed under state law. And then this year there was an attempt to shrink that area retroactively, basically to undo the action that our City Council had taken that was in compliance with state law. So we were gravely concerned about that. We worked with the proponents of the bill and we were able to grandfather in Mesa Central Business District. So we feel good about that. And as various reforms have happened over the years with this, we feel though that it's still in a shape that Mesa will still be able to utilize this. Other cities will be able to utilize this where council deems necessary in the central business districts.
House Bill 2502. This bill provides the, additional help and support to our first responders who may experience traumatic situations on the job. Current statute allows up to 12 licensed counseling visits for first responders who may experience these traumatic events. House Bill 2502 expands the number of 12 visits to 36 counseling visits. It also limits the types of doctors in this program to psychologists and psychiatrists and allows the employee to select their doctor. The bill further requires that the employers collect certain data information submitted to the Department of ADOA, in which they will then compile the data across the state and submit it to the legislature and the governor.
I'll just add to that, Mayor and Council, that we were glad to work with public safety community on coming up with a reasonable compromise on that. There were some initial concerns about the bill as introduced and the fiscal impact that it would have on cities and towns, and so we worked collaboratively as the bill progressed with both fire and police and able to come up with something that everyone was comfortable with as the bill passed.
Senate Bill 1140. This is the result of multiple stakeholder meetings with cable operators across the state who were the proponents of the bill. The initial introduced version of the bill established a statewide cable license issued by the Secretary of State's office instead of allowing cities and towns to have individual cable license. The compromise language included in the bill that passed requires municipalities to adopt a standard form of video service license agreement, in which we must do by this time next year. But the important piece of this legislation is that we were able to maintain the city's right to control our right-of-way. The original language that was introduced significantly impacted this authority. And so we appreciated working with the stakeholders and come up with compromise language that we can all agree to at the end. Do you have anything further on this one?
No, I'm sorry, go, Renee.
Thank you, Mr. Luna.
Thank you for the presentation. I had a question on the franchise agreement. So our franchise agreement's null and void then? And so they have access to our right-of-ways. I know many of the franchise agreements used to fund government channels or PEG channels. So will the Cox Communication continue to fund the government channel? And I don't know where we're at with that.
So the bill does limit the amount of, I think they're called PEG channels, does limit the amount of PEG channels per municipality. In regard to current agreements and moving forward into this standard uniform license agreement, there is a date established in the statute. I think it's might be January 1, 2020. It's 2020 that allows that changeover to happen. I think our current license expires in 2020.
I believe, I know staff could verify it. We are at the end of, Mayor and Vice Mayor, we're at the end of our term, at least with Cox Communications, on our license agreement, and that was something that staff would have been working on, a renewal of that had this bill not passed. Now, our relationship with Cox and all cable operators will go through this statewide arrangement. But as Miranda indicated, there are certain specifications that they've allowed from PEG channels to others that we'll still maintain. The bill's not perfect. It's far from perfect. And at the end of the day, there were, the legislative process is always an ugly one. We were able, though, to maintain control of our right-of-way, which was something that we were concerned about as the bill neared the finish line, because there were still provisions in the bill that we believe gave cable preferential treatment over other utilities in the right-of-way. And so we were able to address some of those issues to ensure that we maintain the control just like we had in small cell legislation and other things in the past. So we felt good about that. It'll be interesting to see if there's other revisions of the bill as both sides start to look at implementation and what that means. But to your question, other cities have just entered into 20-year contracts, and I certainly, Mr. Smith might indicate this, but we're hearing that some cities will likely sue, stating that it's an infringement upon their contract, and that they should be allowed to complete their term before the legislation goes into effect. So that you'll probably see that play out in the courts in the coming months. Great. And before we go on to the issue of sober living homes, were there any other questions you had about any of the bills presented or any of the other fun at the state legislature this year?
To Mr. Luna's question, so I'm not sure what we receive now from Cox that supports the Channel 11 function that most of the people watching this meeting are taking advantage of. Is that going to go away in 2021 when this legislation kicks in?
Mayor, I know we actually are meeting internally, staff here in the next few days to start working through some of the provisions of the legislation. We'll be glad to follow up. There may be staff that could have already looked at certain components of that, and certainly I'd welcome them to come up and speak to some of the different funding options that you had discussed. But we believe that there was a fair amount of revenue sharing that was contemplated still on this, much like our previous agreements had, and so we'll be monitoring that. But Mayor, why don't we, instead of me speaking off the cuff, why don't we dive into that and get back to you with some information on that?
Thank you. Any other questions, Council? If not, sober living homes is the next
Certainly, and I know probably the issue that's going to generate the most discussion today, as you all are probably aware, sober living homes have been an issue that communities have been grappling with for numerous years, and there has been attempts at the state legislature to come up with legislation on how cities can regulate sober living facilities. This year, though, instead of looking at a scheme of city regulation, it actually envisioned and provided for statewide regulation and licensing of sober living facilities in the Arizona Department of Health Services. And the same legislator who had run the bill a few years ago, providing the framework that Mr. Smith and his office will talk about in a few minutes, also ran this legislation, because I think the feedback was that they didn't believe that previous legislation went far enough and provided that stable framework. Also, the industry was concerned about a patchwork of regulation from city to city. So the idea of a statewide license housed at the Department of Health Services started to gain ground and was ultimately passed by the legislature this year. So with that, why don't I turn it over to Mr. Smith to go through the provisions of this bill and ideas that we have moving forward.
Yeah. Mayor and Council, thank you, Scott. Senate Bill 1465, and as the slide shows, places sober living homes under the regulation of DHS. This is something the city of Mesa, the league, and many cities have wanted for a number of years. So this is a significant change, and we've really looked forward to this. And so it's an extensive statute. I won't go through all the regulations within it. What it really does is set up a framework, and then DHS within the next 2 years is to adopt regulations, which will ultimately be the implementation. Because it's up to 2 years, and because of the concerns that citizens provided to council a few weeks ago, my office started working on an interim solution too. And that interim solution is found in Prescott. Prescott, approximately a year ago, and for about a year, has had a structured sober living ordinance in place. And we're looking at largely mimicking that ordinance and those provisions. It is not as broad as Senate Bill 1465, and that's exactly why Prescott, Mesa, and the League and many cities have for a long time looked for the very legislation that got passed. But the Prescott legislation does provide for a number of things in certain circumstances for a structured sober living. And it's pursuant to a state statute, and that state statute, as I've probably already mentioned, is not as broad as 1465. But it provides for a house manager, operational plan, intake, relapse and discharge procedures, minimum training, good neighbor policy, and some detail regarding all of that when that ordinance is applicable. And so we're looking at mimicking that and bringing that to council for introduction on the July 2nd meeting. Right now, we're working on trying to get this to you before the break, and then for adoption at the following council meeting right before the break. As we discuss these types of issues, it's important to remember in regulating sober living homes that they are group homes for the handicapped. And I'm going to read a couple provisions, and this is because sometimes people want to dispute or delve into this issue. And so what I'm going to read from is a joint statement from HUD and the Department of Justice. And this is the law, and this is how it's enforced on the federal level, and that's not really for discussion today. The Fair Housing Act protects on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, disability, familial status, and national origin. Sober living homes are considered a disability, and specifically case law and DOJ have stated that group homes include homes occupied by persons in recovery from alcohol or substance abuse who are persons with disabilities under the Act, and that the Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of the disability. And so that's really important in sort of framing sort of the tenor of the conversation. And the reason why it's really important, and why I ask, is that it's important to be thoughtful in your comments in this. And because the reason why it's thoughtful to be in comments is because DOJ and the courts look at the comments at hearings like this, actually in making some of their decisions. In fact, I'll quote from the Department of Justice. When enacting these types of laws, governments may not act because of fears, prejudice, stereotypes, or unsubstantiated assumptions that community members may have about current or prospective residents because of their residents' protected characteristics. Doing so violates the act, even if the officials themselves do not personally share such bias. And in fact, I can read from a case in which the court specifically looked at statements that were made at hearings like this, in which there were statements that described the people in the recovery homes as not truly handicapped, criminals, gang members, and druggies, among other derogatory terms. That's a quote from a case. And so, and that ultimately, those regulations were overturned in that city. And so I just ask both the council and the public to be thoughtful in their comments, because as we move forward, we are looking to provide the same protections that are in Prescott. That's found for the community if they'd like to look it up. It's in Chapter 4-11 of the Prescott City Code. We're in the process of mimicking those provisions and bringing those to council. You know, Prescott's ordinance, I think, really sort of frames the concept well in their intents portion of their ordinance. The intent of this chapter is to protect the residents of structured sober living homes from operators who engage in abuse, neglect, mistreatment, fraud, and/or inadequate supervision of the vulnerable population, as well as to protect the residents of structured sober living homes and the neighboring community from operators who fail to provide the supportive residential family-like living environment necessary to achieve and maintain sobriety. And so that's the type of ordinance we'll be drafting and bringing forward to council. They've had it on the books for more than a year. They have not had a legal challenge or even a threat of a legal challenge, and it is consistent with the state law. So we'll bring this back to you on July 2nd. We're bringing this to you early just to show, you know, because I know there was community interest in this and wanted to show that we're working on this immediately. And you know, the larger solution really is with DHS. I just got before this meeting a notice that they intend to have their regulations in place within 18 months. And so hopefully we can encourage them to do that faster because that 1465 is the long-term solution. Thank you, Mayor and Council.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Council, we do have 5 cards that have been filed so far to speak on this. Should we go ahead and hear from them at this time, or any questions for staff before we do that? Okay, thank you very much. I'll invite the folks that have given us blue cards up to speak. If we have some others, please get those to the clerk as soon as you can. And we'll just take them in the order that they're in the stack. Again, you have 3 minutes. And again, this is free speech, so you can say what you want to as long as it's within reason. But as Mr. Smith indicated earlier, if there are comments that come up during either council discussion or public discussion of this that make it look like we are attacking people that are considered by the government to be vulnerable and need to be protected, that could ultimately come back in a legal setting to say that we are doing this, that we're trying to violate federal protections of people that deserve to be protected. So I just ask you to be thoughtful in your comments and not derogatory towards people that need help in our community. Okay, let's start with Michael Harris. Mr. Harris. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Harris, and I'm the CEO and founder of Valjean Society. We are a 501c3 organization that recently acquired a property at 138 North Pomeroy with the intention of working with 5 men in recovery as they transition back into the community. I myself had the same life. I'm 6 years sober. I'm 3.5 years out of prison. I work for a very prominent nonprofit in Mesa. My wife and children support me, stayed with me through the entire process and made that possible. Our aim is to work with 5 men intensely for the last 6 months of their incarceration and to assist them in coming out to a stable environment with proper expectations of the incredible amount of work it's going to take for them to recover from that life, just as I have. We're focused on family reunification, financial stability and literacy, education, job placement. If I repeat myself, I apologize. And I've taken 3.5 years to do this. I didn't rent a place and just pack it full of people and hope they can pay rent. I paid for all of this myself up until now. Recently, an investor did purchase the house on our behalf. I understand there are fears and concerns and stigmas. I just want to be heard and given the opportunity to advocate for those like myself who otherwise run into nothing but roadblocks when they get out, but they're required to succeed or go back. Societally, we don't want people to go back. We want people to have an opportunity to recover. But in a situation like this, it's very emotionally charged, and I get that. I want to invite anybody that's from the neighborhood to reach out to me. I'll make myself available at all times. I want to appease concerns and provide for the men in this particular situation. It's only men that I'm working with. I don't know how to receive questions in this environment, and I'm a little bit nervous, but we're very excited. It's taken us 3.5 years. I found a place that's perfectly located, proximity to light rail, probation, Mesa Library, all resources that downtown Mesa provides. And if I could have done it in my neighborhood and it had those amenities, I would have done so. But it was here, and we're very excited to be here. And I want to build great family relations, or excuse me, neighbor relations and relationships with the municipality of Mesa, with whom I have been working for a few months to make sure that we are in full compliance for zoning, planning, fair housing, HUD. And this just fits every box. And I'm really sorry if it's upset anybody, but I hope to change that relationship.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. I've neglected to tell you you had 3 minutes, but you ended exactly at 3 minutes.
I had a
so-
timer in front of me.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you.
Nice job. Priscilla Crosswhite.
Okay, good evening, Mayor, council members, and staff members. I appreciate the fact that you're listening to us tonight about this. I have a couple of notations. I marked down that you said that one of the goals in the zoning that you mentioned, or the statute you mentioned, is family life living environment for these people that are handicapped or recovering addicts. But this house on Pomeroy, 138 North Pomeroy, is about 800 square feet. I looked it up, and it has 4 rooms. How can 4 or 5 big men have a family living environment in such small quarters? I mean, are they going to be living in the kitchen and the bathroom, or how does that be? I don't see how that's appropriate, and I don't know. Maybe I don't know what they're planning on doing. Maybe it's bunk beds or something, but it seems like a lot of people they're putting in really small spaces. And I don't know if that's healthy and how they can consider that a healthy living environment. My other question was, what does this come under as far as our own city council zoning laws? Does it come under 1186-2, which is the correctional transitional housing facilities? Does anybody know? Is that what it comes under in the city of Mesa zoning laws?
Here, we can get back to those questions afterwards if you want.
Pose all the questions you'd like, and we'll have staff address them, okay?
Okay, I was just wondering if it comes under that. If it does, then I'm not sure if it is appropriately in an appropriate zoning situation, because we have one house over on Hibbert that's right across the street from 2 different churches. The one on Pomeroy is across the street from a park, and it's across the street from a church and a YMCA where little children actually have programs. Now, I don't know how, that's the zoning on this. And if it comes under this city zoning, then it means the city council members have the right to make an exception. And is that what is happening with these? Is the council making exceptions to put these transitional homes in our neighborhood? And my other question is, since we're a historic neighborhood, how does that figure in with our historic neighborhood? Is this going to be running our house values, our property values down. I was told that our house values are gonna just dive. And the last thing I wanted to say was that I got a phone call this morning. I get cards and letters every single day. And I had a phone call this morning from someone who said they were a small corporation. They're buying up houses in our neighborhood. They're doing it to rent them out. And so that's kind of the same thing. It's like a lot of them are coming into our neighborhoods to do this, and I just don't know why. And we need some help with that. We can't have our historic neighborhood turn into like a total rental place, and it's not that I don't like helping people, I do. And I'm all for helping people. It just seems wrong in this area, and the way they're doing it, cramming them in these little houses. I mean,
Okay.
I think they deserve better than that.
Thank you, Priscilla.
Thank you.
Mr. Smith, do you want to respond to some of those questions?
So-
Again, this is not, there's no council action here. We're not issuing any kind of permit or taking anything to create or respond to any specific situation. What's on the agenda is an overview of where we're at with regard to state law and proposed city law. Is that right? But I think she did raise some questions that hopefully you can respond to.
Yeah, I know a couple of the answers, and probably John corrected me too. Sober living homes fall within group homes for the handicap, and so that's they don't fall within the correctional transitional housing facilities. Now, I don't know whether a particular home qualifies as a sober living home or a correctional transitional housing facility. She'd probably want to go to the planning department and see John and their department to talk about particular instances, and so.
Okay.
But council isn't granting an exception or changing the zoning code. In fact, this regulation won't be in the zoning code.
Okay. Thank you. Carl Gregory. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Council and Mr. Mayor, for letting me speak. My name is Carl Gregory. I live at 144 North Wilbur. I'm presenting for the Jensen family who are unable to speak at this time. And I first want to say that it's a very rare opportunity when a house in this neighborhood comes up for sale in the Glen Wilbur district, being that most of them have been owned by families for generations, some currently in those families who have lived there for 30-plus years. And when they come up for sale, we're hoping, it's hoped that a good family will come in and help stabilize it with a good environment. Two families moved in, Jensen's, and they wanted to invest by restoration, stabilizing, whatever. As I understand, the Jensens sunk in about $170,000 on their property, and as soon as they moved in, there was a sober living house, halfway house, and as you see the pictures, those are examples of that. And it has been reported that various people in there had been peering into the baby's bedroom. Also, and I have to say that this is a very unsafe situation. The yard right next to their house, there were found condoms, cigarettes, syringes with whatever they were using. Imagine if a child came in and picked up the syringe and got stuck with the possibility of contracting HIV or some other disease that might have been in one of these people in the halfway house. And if that were to happen, they're thinking about moving out, as I understand. And the organization that started the house is the Eris Foundation. And it's my understanding that they have not taken really responsibility on this. This is an unsafe situation, which can lead to fire, and the need for fire department and the police if that happens. And I would like to say in conclusion, I wouldn't want to live in that, and if more people left and allowed this to happen, it would be an unsafe area. And I would have to ask myself, would I want to continue living in there? And thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl. Kane Black.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening to me. My name is Kane Black. I live at 136 North Pomeroy. I'm at the house directly next to the 138. And when my wife and I, before we moved into the neighborhood, we had done a lot of research looking around the neighborhood because we were trying to fight the stigma that Mesa has a lot of negative stereotypes. So I had friends telling me, don't move here, or don't move there, it's a bad place to live. And but we moved in, we did our own, we talked to people in the neighborhood. We're right behind the firehouse there. I spoke to the people in the firehouse, just lovely people around in the neighborhood. And right next to us at 138 was the Contreras family. And they never hesitated to help us out, let us know just to help us with anything. And so out of nowhere, their house was sold out from under them. I follow Zillow, the real estate app, and I got a notification their house was sold. Their landlord sold the house out from under them that they had planned to buy. They had lived there for 10 years. And he sold it out from under them to a mystery buyer, someone who bought the house blindly, and then notified them that their house would be turned into a halfway home. And basically, I have a 2-year-old daughter and I have a month-old son, and this is where we moved into to build our roots. And when stuff happens, like a family next to us being uprooted, it just goes against of what I felt the neighborhood represented. And I support rehabilitation. I know people make mistakes. People are human, they make mistakes, and they spent their lifetime repenting for their mistakes. But I also don't underestimate the potential for human failure. And I don't believe that a place like a sober home is appropriate to be right between a house with a toddler, a baby, and a house on the other side where my neighbor's grandchildren visit him several times a week. I just don't believe it's the proper place to do it. So, thank you.
Thank you, Kane. Barbara Valenzuela Sutphin.
Good evening, Mayor and City Council members. My name is Barbara Valenzuela Sutphin of 1910 East Maryland Avenue, 85204. Today, I would like to address the issue of the proliferation of halfway or sober living houses within the historic square mile. My mother lives on North Pomeroy Street, right behind Fire Station Number 1. Slated to open in July, there will be a new sober living site next door to her home. My mother had hoped to live out her remaining years in the tranquil and secure neighborhood she'd known for the last 70 years. My mother is 93. While I no longer live in this neighborhood, I am concerned that my neighborhood will be next. We were unsure of exactly what type of clientele this house would serve. And at the time that we asked the owner-manager, he refused to give us any information. I am concerned as a daughter and a citizen at the lack of zoning regulations required by the City of Mesa at this time for these types of houses to come into residential neighborhoods. At this time, all that is required is a permit, and there is no public approval process involved. A lemonade stand requires more oversight. Lemonade stands are not allowed in residential neighborhoods because they are considered businesses. And yet, the sober living halfway house or sober living or halfway houses are technically businesses. They charge their clients $100 or more per week. It's a cash cow for the owners, because very little is done for them in terms of rehabilitation. I am pleased that the City of Mesa is taking action to write stricter regulations, much like Phoenix. But I would like to recommend that until these regulations are written and in effect, that a moratorium be put in place so that no more houses are allowed to open at this particular time. Right now, our laws are weak, and those of the surrounding cities are stronger: Tempe, Chandler, Gilbert, and Phoenix. There is a land rush in acquiring cheap property for use as sober or halfway houses right now in Mesa. I congratulate you for your actions in the public interest on the behalf of the citizens of Mesa. Mesa should be known for its quality of life and neighborhoods, its commitment to education, and its cultural events, not its preponderance of halfway or sober living businesses. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Barbara. Mr. Smith, could you respond to that as well? Currently, if someone wants to initiate a sober living home, and I know, Genevieve, we're still coming back to you, but do they come to the city of Mesa and get a license, or is there any city approval that's needed to do this, or is that not part of something that we're allowed to regulate?
So it depends on if there are more than 6 people. And so if it's more than 6 people, there are regulations. But other than that, if it's under 6 people, there aren't, which I'll just say is consistent with almost all our neighboring cities. The only cities that have structured sober living ordinances in place that I'm aware of right now are Prescott, that has had it for a year. Phoenix passed one. It actually doesn't go in effect, I don't think, for another couple of weeks, so they have not begun regulating them. I think a couple cities have permit requirements just like they do on every business, but they don't actually provide any additional regulation on their structured sober living. So we would be joining with Prescott and Phoenix actually on that.
Okay, thank you. Janice Genevois.
Good evening, council and mayor and citizens. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to us. As you know, I've been residing in the Glenwood-Wilbur Historic District since its inception. And I've worked very hard as a citizen to try to create stability in a beautiful historic district with contributing properties. One of my concerns is that it's not just sober living homes. Every time that I try to address this issue with our neighborhood office or one of the owners or a city council member, they tend to change the wording. So when we say, well, it's violating this ordinance, then they go, oh, it's not that, it's a CTHF. So then when we say, well, it's violating the CTHF, well, then they say, well, now it's a sober living home. And they keep changing the language every time that we try to have a discussion. Because the truth is, the one on Pomeroy is not a sober home, it's housing parolees. The one on Hibbert is housing those with sober issues. And I am all for recovery. That isn't the issue. But I have come here tonight to request that the city of Mesa put a stay on processing any more transitional living homes in the downtown square mile until we have a proper process set up. Because it's my understanding no permit is required. It's a one-page form and $1,000 and you're in. Here's the thing. These houses are not setting up in Scottsdale, Gilbert, or Chandler simply because they have really high property values and they have property taxes. So it's not really affordable to set them up there. And these entities are not setting up in Phoenix because they've adopted the 1465. And they're not setting up in Glendale and Tempe because they already have an ordinance, which I have sent to some of you, on restrictions. They don't allow them in single-family residences. That's what we would like to see happen in Mesa. We don't think these should be in single-family residences. And during this opioid crisis, what is happening and all of the new loopholes that the Trump administration have opened up in banking and real estate, investors are buying these up and they are making an enormous amount of money. The one that we have talked about on Eris, they're providing absolutely no 12-step program, no they're not providing any recovery services to those individuals at all. And it appears that there's a concentration of these homes in the square mile. And I was just wondering if anyone here would be willing to tell me what your cross streets are and if you're having the same problem in your neighborhood. Because it seems like it's down here, but not so much in other areas of Mesa. Am I wrong? I'm wrong. You got them next door?
They're in our neighborhoods.
They are in your guys' neighborhoods too. You're battling the same thing? That's good to know. I just think that I appreciate all the work that you guys have done, but I keep on getting the same answer. We're gonna wait, we're gonna wait, we're gonna wait. I know you're gonna work on something, but mostly we're gonna wait a couple years and see if there's litigation. And my point is, what's gonna happen is they're not setting up in these other cities. It's really cheap and easy to come to Mesa, and that's where they're gonna come. The problem is gonna get bigger and bigger by the time we finally get around to addressing it. So I think that I'm hopeful that we can maybe just put a stay on it until we figure out a correct process. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Janice. Council, now's the time to discuss this. Any comments? I should note that Mr. Freeman is online. Mr. Freeman, if you want to join in, please let us know. Mr. Thompson.
I will, Mayor. Thank you.
Just to address that, to follow up, yes, it is, we do have sober living homes throughout the city. It's not just in our downtown area. We have them in my neighborhood. We have them throughout District 6. I know Councilmember Luna has quite a few in District 5 as well. So, you know, they are unregulated. For the most part, I think the state has some type of regulation over them, but they are throughout the city. It's not just concentrated in one area. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of that.
This has been a great discussion. I hope folks know that we are anxious to be engaged in this issue and to provide all the protection possible to preserve the residential character of our neighborhoods, while at the same time being respectful of the societal need to protect vulnerable people and to allow them to progress in life. So this is not an issue that's peculiar to Mesa, Arizona, or any of the cities in the Valley of the Sun. This is happening across our country. But just to kind of help set people's expectations, Mesa is going to be one of the, at the lead of the pack in addressing these issues. As was indicated earlier, currently Prescott and Phoenix have ordinances addressing this. At our next regular city council meeting following this one on July the 2nd, we will, it's proposed that we will join that small group of cities that do have city ordinances that address this. So I think we are one of the cities that's leading in this area. Let me talk to the folks that live in the Wilbur Historic District. Thank you for caring about our community. Thank you for caring about your neighborhood. Thank you for investing in an historic neighborhood. I want you to know that you're not going to be sorry that you live in that neighborhood. There are great things ahead for the Wilbur Historic District. There are great things ahead for downtown Mesa. But as our first speaker indicated, because of the assets that are located in downtown Mesa, including access to light rail and libraries and a lot of public amenities, it's an attractive place to live for you and for folks that might be attracted to a group home. So that's the environment that we have downtown. There's a lot of assets, and so it's going to attract people to our downtown. But I think you know that Site 17, the city owns nearly 20 acres of property immediately across the street from your neighborhood, and we're committed to developing that in a very positive way for your neighborhood to bring owner-occupied residential new homes to downtown Mesa, something we haven't seen in a generation or more, that I think is going to be a real, is going to really help your neighborhood. So if you're a little bit discouraged right now, please hang on, and I think you'll see some great things in your neighborhood in the near future.
Mr. Freeman has a question.
I'm sorry?
Mr. Freeman has a question.
We'll get to Mr. Freeman's question in just one second. So to help set expectations, July the 2nd, we're going to adopt, I hope, our own ordinance. Now, the real answer to the questions that I think are being raised here lies in the state statute that was passed in our last legislative session, the Senate Bill 1465. That Senate bill is a lot stronger than any of the city ordinances that we're talking about. And so the ordinances that we're talking about adopting that have been adopted by our neighboring cities are just a stopgap to get to the point that the Department of Health Services, DHS, adopts the regulations that will then trigger this state statute to come into effect. So the best thing we can do at this point, even better than adopting these short-term ordinances, is to encourage DHS to move expeditiously in adopting those regulations to trigger the long-term solution, which is the new state statute. So we are having this year I am chairing the Resolutions Committee for the Arizona League of Cities and Towns, and I'm going to be proposing a resolution calling on DHS to move quickly in adopting those regulations. That will happen at our August Arizona League of Cities and Towns convention. But for those of you who are passionate about this issue, I would encourage you to lobby DHS, the governor's office, everyone to say there's no reason to wait 2 years or 18 months to adopt the resolution, the regulations, so that this more all-encompassing statute can come into effect. Let's do that quickly so that the neighborhoods and group home providers can start following the more long-term solution as quickly as possible. So that is, I think the most honest answer that we can give people that care about this issue is that's the long-term solution that we need to work on. Some of these other issues are really short-term solutions. But thank you. So please come back on July the 2nd when we're talking about this more. Mr. Freeman, do you have any comments?
Thank you, Mayor. You covered my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. If there's nothing else, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is to hear reports on meetings. I thank you very much for your attendance, and we will convene upstairs in a moment if you'd like to continue watching that as well. The next item is to hear reports on meetings and conferences attended. Council, anything you'd like to share? If not, Mr. Brady, help us with scheduling of future meetings.
Sure. Our next study session will be Thursday, the 21st at 7:30 a.m. And I also understand Thursday from 5:30 to 6:30, Councilman Freeman will be having a mobile office hours at Fire Station 218, which is 845 North Alma School, 5:30 to 6:30 on Thursday, June 21st. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there a motion to adjourn this meeting? Thank you. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. We are adjourned.